Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how I built this trellis to add a little bit of privacy and shade to the back porch. Let's get started. So one day there I was out in my shop minding my own business, trying to clean up my bench which is perpetually filthy, and I received a text from one of my nieces. A trellis. All right, what am I getting myself into? So since we were starting from basically nothing on this project, I began by going over to my niece's house to take some measurements and check out the backyard to see the best place to install it and to ask her about exactly what kind of design and style she was after. So with measurements in hand and a good idea of exactly what she was looking for, I hopped into some 3D design software to come up with a plan that I hoped she and her husband were going to like. Now this design software that I'm using is called Tinkercad. It's actually just a website and it's free to use, and I'm happy to share the final design that I came up with anybody who'd like to build a trellis just like this. Now I know this can look complicated, but don't be intimidated. Tinkercad is actually really easy to use and very simple to learn. I spent about 3 or 4 hours on the design, and then after some back and forth with my niece, this is the final version that we settled on. The section hanging off to the left there is intended to support a hanging basket of flowers, and we couldn't put anything off the right because it'll be right up against their house. With the design finalized, then I could order the lumber that I needed, in this case some cedar, from a local lumber yard, and once it arrived, I could get started with the construction. When approaching a big project like this, I like to break the construction down into different phases. So for this one, the first phase is to plane down all of the lumber, to remove any of the rough, unfinished faces, and also to get it to the correct dimensions. Okay, I've set up my planer behind me because the wood that I'm going to be using for this project is wood that I got at a local lumber yard. And one side of it is nice and finished, but the other side on a lot of the pieces is still really rough. And I did that kind of on purpose, mostly because cedar is really hard to come by in the sizes that I needed for this project at a Lowe's or a Home Depot or other big box store. So just be aware, if you're going to pick up lumber from a local lumber yard, you'll need to have a way to finish off some of the sides. So one other quick note while you watch me finish planing all of this lumber. Chances are, if you're going to build a trellis like this, it's not going to be a surprise birthday present to be installed in somebody else's house. So you'll have the luxury of being able to set your posts in concrete first at the install location and then build the trellis in place right there. But that's not what I got to do. I'm going to build the entire thing in my garage first and then transport the finished trellis to their house on a day when he's at work, when I can have enough time to dig the post holes, set up the trellis, put in the concrete, and hopefully have it completely installed and finished as a surprise when he gets home. At least that's the plan anyway. We'll see if I can get everything finished in time. Also for me, planing is one of the most satisfying woodworking activities. The wood goes in really rough and comes out just silky smooth. I love it. Once I finished all of the planing, I flipped my stand that I built in a previous video over to the chop saw side, and then using this cut list that I generated off of my Tinkercad designs, I cut all of the lumber to the correct lengths. And I'll share this down in the description below in case you'd like to build this exact same trellis. So one quick tip I can give you here when you're cutting all of your lumber to the correct length, I like to use a technique called gang cutting, which saves a bunch of time when you need to cut a bunch of lumber to the same size. To do this, I mark and cut the first piece, and then I use that to mark a pile of the rest of them. Then I can cut through that whole pile all at once. Just make sure that they're all lined up perfectly, and you'll wind up with a whole pile exactly the same size. Once I'd cut everything to length properly, then I started on the cross members that were going to be mounted on the very top of the trellis. These required some diagonal cuts, and again I used a similar technique to gang cutting, where I cut off the first piece and then I used that as a template to mark all of the rest. And for these I decided to cut them all one at a time rather than using a gang cut. That way you can enjoy this sweet, sweet time lapse. With everything planed down smooth and cut to the correct lengths, my next step then is to use the table saw to rip everything to the final correct dimensions. Now, ripping wood with a table saw is not terribly complicated, and you don't have to have the world's nicest table saw. Mine's about 20 years old and wasn't all that nice when I bought it in the first place, but you can see it's managing to get through this okay. You can see in this shot, one of the things that I did in order to save money, because cedar is actually quite expensive, is I bought some bigger posts that I could cut down to the correct sizes myself on the table saw. You can see here I'm cutting this post into thirds roughly, and that's going to give me the correct sizes that I need. And buying a single post like this was far less expensive than buying 3 separate 2x4s that I still would have had to cut down. Once everything was cut to the final dimensions, the next step is to sand everything with my belt sander. Now, if you don't have a belt sander, you can do this by hand. It'll just take you a little longer. And this just smooths off all the faces and removes any leftover burrs or rough cuts that were left on the lumber. Then next I used my palm router to round over the corners so that the final look would have some softer edges. This step's completely optional, but I really like the result, as it takes those sharp corners and makes them nice and rounded so that you're not likely to get any splinters on them. And with everything now dimensioned and sanded and ready for assembly, I decided to do a quick little cleanup of all the sawdust I generated so far so that I'd have a nice clean environment to do the assembly. With things cleaned up a bit, I could lay out my 2 big vertical posts and get started installing what I'm calling the edge pin boards. These are some small boards I'm attaching directly to those vertical posts, and these will be used to anchor each end of the horizontal slats that are going to run across the main body of this trellis. So I'm a pretty big believer in measure 16 times and only have to cut maybe twice. And as such, when I start assembling things, I like to do a dry fit first. So I measured where they needed to go, and then used several clamps to hold them firmly in place so that I could pre-drill for the 3-inch deck screws that I'm using to install them. Then I could take the screws back out and fill that joint with some waterproof exterior grade wood glue. Make sure you put enough glue in there to completely fill this joint and spread it out with a small paintbrush or even just your finger. And then once I've got enough glue ready for that joint, I can just fit everything back together again and attach things permanently. And then continuing on with the idea of doing a dry fit for everything first, I then laid out all the rest of the horizontal slats, and you'll see here using this dry fit technique was really beneficial. See, my original plans showed that I was supposed to have about a 2.5-inch gap between the top header and the first horizontal slat. You can see I'm very carefully measuring a 2.5-inch gap right here. And then I used this little 2-inch block to very carefully make sure that all the rest of the slats were exactly 2 inches apart. So I did this all the way down this side, and the plans say I should have had about a 2.5-inch gap at the bottom between the bottom slat and the footer, but I actually wound up with a gap that was not the right size. So I decided to go back and re-measure the top to be 3 inches down instead of 2.5, and then I could just use my 2-inch block to set the spaces again. This left me with consistent spacing everywhere, and now that I was sure that the layout was correct, I could start to attach things permanently. For these I used 2-inch deck screws, along with a little dab of glue in each of the joints just to make sure things would be extra strong. And here's how we're looking at this point. The 2 vertical posts are finished, and all my horizontal slats are installed, though you can probably see here some of them are pretty wavy. We'll deal with that here in a minute. I flipped the trellis over off camera so that I could install the header and the footer on the back side as well. Now after I'd done that, I came across another little issue that I hadn't realized with my design, and that is there's this little gap here between the vertical stabilizing bars and the header and the footer. So to deal with this, I cut a small insert that can be put in there, which will provide the correct offset so I can still securely screw these together. As you can see, I'm still using the same glue and screws technique for all of these joints. So now I'm ready to place this vertical slat as well, but I want to make sure that it is spaced visually so that it looks like it's even. Now I can't just measure from the center of this slat to the center of this edge, for instance, because there's another plate that's going to go on top of this side. So let's pick up that and put it on. Get it lined up pretty close to where it's going to be. Now I can measure from the inner wall of this to the inner wall of this and put this slat dead in the center. With all the horizontal cross members taken care of, I could turn my attention to installing the big header post. I placed it where it needed to be and then countersunk some fairly deep holes so that I could get some 3-inch deck screws to hold this in place. Note that this is not the only means of attaching this big header. These are basically just to kind of tack it in place so that I can assemble the rest of it with the larger lag bolts that will provide the strength that's actually needed to hold this thing. So with the header attached, I could lay on these 2x6s that I'm going to use as trim boards that are also kind of structural because they're going to tie everything together with lag bolts. And I used lag bolts to install the trim pieces not only on the upper cross member, but also down each of the legs. Now if you're building this out of cedar like I was, or another fairly soft wood, be kind of careful as you're putting in these lag bolts as they can strip out the holes. I would shoot them in almost all of the way with my screw gun, and then come back and finish them off by hand to make sure I didn't strip anything out. Alright, before I put on the upper cross pieces, one last thing that I want to address is that these slats, though they are spaced perfectly evenly at the edges, they kind of warp and bend and have quite a bit of bow to them. For instance, these two here are way too far apart, and these two here are about right, but these two here are also way too far apart. So to fix this, I'm going to have to anchor these slats along these vertical support pieces. So I measured the first one to be exactly 3 inches off of the header, just like I did at the ends, and then I screwed that one in. With this first gap set correctly to be 3 inches, then I can go through and use my spacer that I used for laying all of these out to set the gap at 2 inches for all of the remaining boards. I'm really glad that I used a little spacer like this. It saves so much time because you don't have to think about measuring anything or worry that your measurements aren't right. Just set the spacer in, hold the pieces together, and you're guaranteed it's going to be exactly right every time. I wound up needing to attach them to all 3 of these vertical posts to get all of the warping and bending out of all of these slats. With all of those slats taken care of, the next step was to just make sure that I didn't have any other little gaps on any of my trim pieces. I did find one little gap from a slightly warped 2x6, but quickly corrected it by using a 3-inch deck screw to suck that down and remove that gap. Next, it was time to cut out all of the horizontal cross members that were going to go across the top. As with all of the other things I needed to cut out a bunch of, I very carefully measured the first one, and when I was satisfied that I'd marked it correctly, I took it over to the bandsaw to carefully cut out that notch. Now, if you don't have a bandsaw, a jigsaw can do this just as well. With the first notch cut out, brought it over to check the fit, and I'm pretty satisfied with that, so I can use this as a template to mark all of the other cross members as well. I then repeated the process of cutting out and checking the fit of all of the rest of them. Then next I pre-drilled for the long lag screws that I was going to use for installing these. Now I used my drill press for this to make sure I got them in perfectly vertically. If you don't have a drill press, you can just use a hand drill. Just be really careful you put them in as close to vertical as you could possibly get. With these cross members all cut to the correct sizes, I noticed a bunch of them still had some fairly rough areas where I had cut them. And rather than trying to get my roundover bit into all the nooks and crannies here, I decided to just do these the old-fashioned way with some sandpaper and elbow grease. Here are the lag screws I'm going to be using for the final installation of these cross members. To install these, I first placed the cross member where it was going to go and put in the first screw but didn't seat it all the way. This left it loose enough that I could then use my square to make sure that things were perfectly perpendicular, and then I could seat the second screw all the way, then go back and completely seat the first screw. And with that, my assembly is completely finished. And I gotta say, this thing looked awesome. But in order to keep it looking fantastic, you need to do some protection on this wood. Cedar is naturally rot and insect resistant, but it will fade to a silver color in the sunlight. So I'm going to use this exterior grade oil-based urethane to protect the wood from the UV of the sun. My original plan was to put on at least 3 coats of this in the garage before I delivered the trellis, but deadlines and birthdays being what they are, I ran out of time to be able to put all the coats of urethane on this in the garage. All I had time for was to use the urethane to seal the legs and the undersides of the trim pieces that would be either difficult or impossible to get to once it was installed. Speaking of getting it installed, the day of the installation had arrived all too quickly, I'm afraid. So with the help of my brother and my son, we were able to get the trellis strapped down really tightly on a trailer and ready for the ride over to my niece's house. But as I mentioned at the beginning, you're probably going to be building this in place rather than assembling it completely and needing to transport it. Nevertheless, I wanted to show you all the steps I went through, so here it is all strapped down and ready for the ride to my niece's house. I rented a post hole digger to dig the holes required to install this trellis, and I should mention before you ever dig anything on your property, you need to check with your local utilities to make sure you're not going to dig through any electrical or gas or any other kind of communication lines that may be buried. In the US, you can dial 811 and the local utility will send out somebody to mark your property, but make sure you give them a few days advance notice so that you have the markings there before you dig. In our case, the only thing I needed to move was this sprinkler head, and rather than try and figure out a completely new place for it, I just kind of dug it up, pushed it out of the way, and happy birthday to my niece's husband. He was going to enjoy a new trellis and enjoy relocating this sprinkler head himself. When installing a permanent structure like this, I like to dig down at least a couple of feet to make sure that there's not going to be any chance that it will just get blown over in a heavy wind. And a post hole digger like this makes very quick work of digging this specific type of hole. After the holes were dug and cleaned up a little bit, I placed a few inches of gravel at the bottom of each of the holes. This is to provide some extra drainage under the concrete. With the holes fully prepped, my brother and my son and I brought the trellis in, and after checking to make sure it was really going to fit, lifted it up and placed it in the holes. Once it was placed in the holes, I braced it up with some scrap lumber so that we could check for vertical and to make sure it was plumb. Now, as soon as we had placed it and made sure it was going to fit, it became fairly obvious that I'd actually dug the holes just a little bit too deep. The reason it was a little too deep is we needed to make sure that the concrete that I'm going to use to seal these could be shaped in such a way that it would shed water off of the top of it and not allow water to pool on the top at all. But the posts were going down so far into the hole that the side trim pieces on the legs were actually down in the hole as well. And those needed to actually be a few inches above ground level so that we could shape the concrete into sort of like a dome so it would shed the water. So we removed all of our bracing and then carefully lifted up each end and added a few more inches of gravel. And this is why dealing with a hole that's too deep is lots easier than dealing with a hole that's not deep enough. Once we were satisfied with the height and had leveled out both legs so that the entire structure was perfectly level, we braced it up again to make sure that it was also perfectly vertical. And then it was time for the concrete. There's lots of different kinds of concrete you can use for this. I went with something that was going to set up pretty quickly. I mixed it in a wheelbarrow until it was about the consistency of a peanut butter or a really thick pancake batter, and then shoveled it into each of the holes until they were all the way to the top. Now this might leave some big air bubbles, so I used a long stake to reach down in there and agitate things and try and get all of the bubbles out that I possibly could. With that done, then I used a little trowel to shape the top to make sure that it was going to shed water like I mentioned. Once all the concrete was in, I used a damp sponge to clean off any excess that had gotten onto the legs. We let the concrete cure for a few days, and then I came back and showed my niece and her husband how to put on a coat of polyurethane. They took care of putting on 2 more coats themselves for a total of 3. And I've got to say, I came back a few days later to see the final finished version with all the polyurethane on it, and I think it looks fantastic. I really like the design, the wood is beautiful, and it really dresses up their back porch and makes it a very inviting and beautiful place to be. Here are some gratuitous shots of the final version. Now I know it may not look like it's going to provide much privacy at the moment, but my niece and her husband are planning to plant some climbing vines underneath it that will turn it into kind of a wall of vegetation before too much longer here, and then it should provide all the privacy that they're looking for on their back porch. And so this is the finished product. I'm really happy with how this trellis turned out. It has made a massive transformation for this back porch, and my niece and her husband are really, really happy with it as well. Hey, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate hearing about it. You can let me know with a little thumbs up down below, or if you've got some ideas or suggestions for ways to improve this trellis, you could let me know down in the comments. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always think about subscribing, but of course there's no pressure there. And as always, thank you very much for watching.